Robert Branson, Betty Beets' son, claims his mother told him she was going to murder her husband, Jimm Don Beets. Branson admits helping drag the body to a hidden grave. He says he was protecting his mother. Beets' daughter, Shirley Stegner, says her mother asked her to help murder another husband, Doyle Barker, back in 1981. She admits helping hide the victim's body.
Hello everyone, today's story is on Betty Lou Beets, who was the fourth woman executed after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. She was executed for killing her fifth husband, Jimm Don Beets.
Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Betty Lou Beets, born Betty Lou Dunavant, was born on March 12, 1937 in Roxborough, North Carolina, to parents Margaret Louise Smithwick and James Garland Dunavant. When Betty was just 3 years old, she suffered from a bad case of the measles, which caused her to lose her hearing. This was challenging for Betty and her family, who lived in poverty and could not afford to give her proper care and treatment. Betty claimed that a couple of years after losing her hearing, she began to get physically, emotionally, and sexually assaulted by James and by other close associates of the family. James eventually found work in another state, so the family moved from North Carolina to Hampton, Virginia. When Betty was 12 years old, her mother Margaret was institutionalized because of her mental health, so Betty was left to care for her younger siblings. Before actually getting checked into the Eastern State Hospital, Margaret was on medication, but she frequently became uncontrollable and had to be sent away. Margaret stayed at the hospital for 3 years and returned when Betty turned 15. Betty's mother was finally home, but soon after coming home, Margaret was sent back to the state hospital for 3 months to undergo electroshock and deep coma insulin therapy. During this hospital stay, Betty's father James turned to alcohol. Betty would often find James drunk and/or passed out on the kitchen floor. Betty's parents were unable to care for their family like parents should be able to do, and it made life harder for her. James became more physical and would irrationally lash out and assault Betty with belts or his bare hands. Betty began suffering from chronic migraines and would have horrible nightmares. The stress grew heavy on her, and she weighed only 82 pounds. For some students, school is an escape when home life isn't the best, but because of Betty's hearing loss and learning disability, she was excluded from her peers, and it was difficult to understand her peers because back then, there was no supplemental education or intervention for her. Her teachers did try sending notes home encouraging Margaret and James to get Betty medical attention, but they were unwilling to help Betty get any special accommodations. Betty's struggles in school never stopped. She failed and had to repeat 4th grade, she was not getting help from her parents, and there was no supplemental support or efforts made to make schooling easier, so she dropped out at the age of 15 in 1952. Also in 1952, Betty married a Robert Franklin Branson. They were married for a year before Betty was claiming that she was being assaulted by Robert, and the two separated. While they were separated, Betty was telling Robert that she no longer wanted to deal with life on Earth, so Robert reconnected with Betty, and they lasted together until 1969 when Betty was 32 years old. They had 6 children together, ranging between the ages of 1 and 15. Betty felt that Robert was similar to her father James, who was paranoid and controlling. One day, Robert wanted to spy on Betty to see what she was up to. She was inside of a laundromat talking to another male patron, and when he noticed that she was talking to someone else, he embarrassed her in front of everyone. He made her get on a public bus and refused to let her see the kids temporarily. A few months after that incident, Robert filed for divorce and stopped paying child support after he quickly remarried a younger woman. Despite him divorcing Betty and being in a new relationship, he would often go to Betty's house requesting the old sex he missed. Betty was used to being married, and it was something she wanted, so the following year in 1970, she married another man by the name of Billy York Lane. Being that Betty married Billy in a haste, she had no clue about Billy's history of drunken nights, jealousy, and physical assaults on his ex-wife. Betty's children and friends all witnessed Billy's treatment towards her. One friend by the name of Connie Faith was quoted saying, "He used to assault her terribly. One time he assaulted her while they were driving. He drove with one hand and was just assaulting her senseless with the other hand. She had to stay in bed laid up for over a week. It was awful." Another acquaintance by the name of Jim Kinson was quoted saying, "He assaulted her real bad. One time she came to work and her eyes were black. Anytime Billy was to leave town, he would sexually brand Betty so that no one would look at her naked body while he was away. She would have bite marks on her breasts, stomach, butt cheeks, and thighs." Betty could no longer take Billy's craziness, so she divorced him the same year they got married in 1970. Billy would not accept the divorce and continued to come around Betty with his ridiculous demands. Betty tried seeking help from a Dr. Leonard Nystrom because she was getting anxiety about bills and a lack of security. Despite the divorce, she was still going to emergency rooms because she was being assaulted by Billy still. On one occasion, Betty's nose was broken, so she decided to shoot Billy. She was arrested and charged with attempted murder, but the charges were dropped when Billy admitted that he had assaulted Betty first, and she reacted in self-defense. Did she feel like she owed Billy for the so-called kind act of admitting his part in the ordeal? Who knows, but Betty decided to remarry Billy in 1973 in the hopes that things would die down. They didn't, and she filed for divorce again in 1975. The following year, Betty began dating a man named Ronnie Threlkeld. She waited longer than her first two marriages to get married, but she eventually married Ronnie in 1978. This marriage was a short and tumultuous one. It ended when Betty tried to run Ronnie over with a car. She claimed that Ronnie physically assaulted her just like her previous husbands. They divorced in 1979, but that same year, Betty married a Doyle Wayne Barker. Doyle had been married multiple times before Betty, and a Dr. Walker said that he had a history of assaulting all of his former wives, and he was labeled as a violent and irrational person. Betty's son Bobby Branson was quoted saying, "Every few days he'd assault Mama, mostly when he was drunk, far as I could see. He drank whiskey and beer. He liked to assault her in the face a lot. She'd always try to cover it up with makeup, but you could see where he assaulted her. Everybody knew, and she knew they knew, but she'd do it anyway. It was really bad. He'd assault her every few days, but every 3 or 4 weeks, she would get it really bad." On April 11, 1980, Betty was involved in a serious car accident. She suffered from a skull fracture, lacerations, a concussion, and permanent brain damage. A doctor wrote in his report that Betty was physically and mentally weak. She would have frequent migraines, she was constantly dizzy, her hearing worsened, she would have challenges concentrating, and she would sometimes lose her equilibrium. One would typically expect their spouse to show empathy, be helpful, considerate, and understanding of the decline in physical and mental health after a bad car accident, but Doyle Wayne Barker had no care in the world. He continued to treat Betty like a dog. The physical assaults continued for a year until one day, Doyle Wayne Barker disappeared. I'm not sure if Leon Lane was one of Betty's sons by her ex-husband Billy York Lane, but in an affidavit, Leon wrote, "I saw Betty the day after Wayne disappeared. She looked really bad. She had a bruised chin, bruises all up on her chest. Both eyes were black. They were dark black, and her arms were covered with big black bruises. It was incredible. We took pictures of her, and you should have seen it. Those pictures were unbelievable. I've never seen anybody so beat up." Although to the outside world, everyone believed Doyle Wayne just up and left without saying a word, Betty and her daughter Shirley knew the truth. I would like to briefly pause the story to ask you all a few questions. Throughout the years, Betty tried to get help from police, but never got any help. She was very young when she first married. Do you think violence was all she knew and what she was used to? It's what she learned and maybe knew no better. Do you feel a battered wife killing a spouse in retaliation deserves the death penalty? There are countless women who have been able to plead insanity after killing the precious human beings they brought into this world. In my opinion, I think that is a more heinous crime than killing a spouse in self-defense. We don't know if Betty was traumatized, brainwashed, and just couldn't take it anymore. This is different than killing for insurance, money, or jealousy, for example. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comments below what you guys think. And now, back to the story. In traditional Betty fashion, Betty met and married a new man by the name of Jimm Don Beets in 1982. Betty had gone through a rough childhood and a young adult life, so she was now immersing herself in drinking and was taking up to 6 diet pills a day, even though she didn't need them. It was also 5 times the recommended dose because the pills contain amphetamines. Drinking and taking the pills was a bad combination and would sometimes cause her to become paranoid, and she also suffered from mania and hallucinations. Dr. Walger would later go on to say that some of the reactions she had were similar to people who would take LSD. On top of her struggles, she would have frequent nightmares about her tumultuous past and was experiencing PTSD. Betty claimed that Jimmy would assault her as well, and their relationship was far from perfect. On August 6, 1983, Betty called the cops to report that Jimmy was missing near her Cedar Creek Lake home in Texas. Police tried searching for Jimmy, but they were unable to find him. At 10:00 p.m. on August 6, 1983, Lil Smith, owner of the Redwood Beach Marina, was notified by several customers that there was an empty boat drifting on the lake near the marina. When 2 customers went to search the boat, they found a fishing license with the name Jimm Don Beets on it. Coast Guards as well as Parks and Wildlife were notified about the boat and a possible missing person. The customers did some investigating on their own and found Jimmy's telephone number listed in the telephone book and decided to call. The first few calls, no one answered. Finally, after a few tries, Betty answered the phone. They told her about the empty boat, so Betty drove to the marina as a concerned wife and confirmed that the boat belonged to her husband. She communicated with authorities, and authorities agreed to start looking for Jimmy the next morning on August 7th when there was more light. Police believed that Jimmy accidentally fell overboard while fishing and had an accident where he was unable to save himself, so they began a search to look for Jimmy's body in the water. Police spent 3 weeks looking for Jimmy in the lake, but they were unable to find him. After months of many people concerned about the whereabouts of Jimmy, Betty remained unbothered. She made no attempts to help find him, and also made no efforts to recover any benefits owed to her as a result of Jimmy's disappearance. A year after Jimmy's death, Betty's trailer was severely damaged due to a fire. She filed a claim with her insurer for the loss of her trailer and its contents, but the insurer refused to give her a payout. Betty was not okay with getting no for an answer, so she hired a lawyer by the name of E. Ray Andrews. Mr. Andrews did some research and found out that Betty's husband, who was now missing, was working for the city of Dallas as a firefighter before his disappearance. Because of the information he learned, when he met with Betty in person for the first time, he asked her about the fire insurance claim and any other claims she may have had to death benefits. He let her know that she was entitled to more benefits and that he would pursue those benefits on top of her fire insurance claim. Even though Betty agreed to Mr. Andrews' contingencies, according to him, Betty was more concerned with the fire insurance claim. Mr. Andrews was able to gather that there were benefits available to Betty as a result of her husband's disappearance or death, and he was about to receive a payment, but Betty was arrested, which spoiled all of his efforts to help her and receive a big pay. It was 1985 when the Henderson County Sheriff's Department received a tip that led authorities to arrest Betty on suspicions of murdering her husband Jimmy. Police obtained a search warrant to search Betty's home, and they saw a filled-in wishing well. Hopefully nobody had been drinking from the wishing well, because they found the remains of Jimmy Beets inside. When authorities searched the garage, they found the remains of her 4th husband, Doyle Wayne Barker. Betty was held in jail, and she was charged with murdering Jimmy for remuneration and the promise of remuneration, or more specifically, she killed him to get proceeds of retirement benefits from the employment of Jimmy with the city of Dallas. The insurance policies, like their estate policy for example, had Betty listed as a beneficiary. Mr. Andrews was greedy. He was unable to help clear Betty's name when it came to her motive for killing Jimmy, because he was the one who suggested getting a payout for the other policies aside from the fire insurance claim. He offered to help Betty by defending her for a capital murder charge, and she agreed. Mr. Andrews believed that Betty's case would rack in millions. For himself, that is. He created a contract that Betty signed that transferred the literary and media rights in the case from Betty to his son, E. Ray Andrews Jr., in exchange for Mr. Andrews to support Betty in trial. One of Mr. Andrews' colleagues was quoted saying, "I remember when E. Ray started talking about getting the book and movie rights in the Beets case. He talked about it several times, both at the Post and at my house. When he finally got the contract signed on the second day of Betty's 4-day trial, he come over to the Post and was excited as he could be. He said how he was going to get rich on all this and the case was going to be the biggest thing that ever happened to him and whatnot. He said the case was going to turn into a big movie and he had all the rights to it. It was something he talked about pretty often, and you could tell he was counting on those rights for a lot of money. When Betty agreed to allow Mr. Andrews, a lawyer who had never represented someone standing trial for murder, she thought he was helping her out of the kindness of his heart. He gave her the contract on October 8th, 1985, which was one day after her trial began, so she felt she had no choice but to sign it. While Betty was being held in jail and before her trial began, 2 of her children confessed to knowing that Betty had been involved in murders, and they admitted that they were somewhat involved as well, so they testified against her during trial.
Defense attorney E. Ray Andrews insists Beets' children are lying.
They're cold-blooded. And further to protect themselves. You heard 2 of them already testify that they had some part in it.
Betty's daughter Shirley claimed that in October of 1981, a couple of years before Jimmy disappeared, she was sitting around a campfire with her mother when Betty randomly told her that she was going to kill Doyle Wayne Barker. She told her that she could not take being assaulted anymore and no longer wanted him around. Betty also told Shirley that the trailer they lived in was in his name and she was just a co-signer, so if they got a divorce, he would get the house, leaving her with nothing. About 3 or 4 days after that campfire conversation, Betty called Shirley and let her know that she had followed through with her plans by waiting until Doyle fell asleep to shoot him. Betty then requested that Shirley help her dump Doyle's body, and Shirley claimed that she was too scared to not follow her mother's wishes. Shirley was quoted saying, "We drug him from the trailer outside to the back and put him in the hole that had already been dug. The hole was there because they were intending to build a barbecue pit." Shirley said the next day they purchased some cinder blocks and built a patio where the body had been placed. Sometime after that, they built a storage shed to replace the patio. Shirley then testified that although she had also been charged with murder after coming forward with information that she assisted her mother in disposing Doyle's body, and her $1 million bail bond was reduced to $5,000, she claimed that she had not been promised anything by the prosecution in exchange for her testimony against her mother. Robert Franklin Branson, aka Robbie, was one of Betty's sons who testified in court as well. The court was made aware that at the time of Jimmy's death, Robbie was on felony probation for committing a burglary that had occurred in Navarro County, and he was living with his mother Betty. Jimmy was also the one who paid his bail money for him to come home. Robbie testified that he was there the day Betty falsely reported Jimmy missing, and she told him that she was planning on killing him later that evening. This meant that Jimmy was alive when she made the missing person call. Robbie claimed that he left the house because Betty didn't want him around when she was going to kill Jimmy. Robbie also claimed that he left the house for about 2 hours, and when he returned, he learned that his mother had shot and killed Jimmy while he was out. He then helped his mother place Jimmy's body in the wishing well that he and Jimmy had previously constructed together. The day after Jimmy was killed, Betty put some of Jimmy's heart pills in the boat, and Robbie removed the propeller off the boat. Robbie was also the one to take Jimmy's boat to the main part of the lake and abandoned it. Betty met up with Robbie at the lake and they both left for home together. Robbie claimed that he never told anyone what happened because he wanted to protect his mother, and he was only coming clean now to protect himself from going to prison for murder because during trial, Betty was claiming that he and his sister Shirley were responsible for the murders of Doyle and Jimmy. Robbie also testified that he only met Doyle a few times and was not living with his mother during the time he was killed and had nothing to do with his death. When Betty took to the stand, she said, "I could never hurt Jimm Don. I loved Jimm Don. Nobody's ever been as good to me as he was." Betty did admit that she falsely reported Jimmy missing though. She claimed that Jimmy was upset with Robbie because he had stolen money from Jimmy and made the house dirty. Betty also testified that all 3 of them had an argument after Robbie quit his job, and the night of the fight, she was in the living room when she heard a gunshot, and when she went into the bedroom, she saw Jimmy lying on the floor dead. She told Robbie to go find his brother Bobby, and in the meantime, she covered Jimmy with a sheet. She then said that she talked to Jimmy's dead body by telling him that he would understand if he were alive why they were going to bury him. After talking to Jimmy's body for a while, she called Shirley and told her that Jimmy went to Dallas with a friend and that everything was all right. She then told the court that she put Jimmy's body in a planter, not a wishing well like everyone else had been saying. Despite her testifying against her children in court, she did tell Robbie that she would take the blame if Jimmy was ever found. Betty then testified, "It bothers me and it always will. I had to move out of the trailer for a while. I couldn't stay there. When it got dark, I couldn't leave the living room and I couldn't go outside." After a year, she told Robbie that they needed to move the body, but in the end, she couldn't follow through with moving the body again. Betty then had to tell the court that it was her lawyer, not her, who suggested collecting on the insurance policies. "I didn't expect any of it. I've never felt like I was entitled to anything." She did, however, admit to selling Jimmy's boat and attempted to sell a different house that Jimmy owned. The court then brought up how Betty had a record and she had previously been convicted of a misdemeanor. Her lawyer, Mr. Andrews, did not have the proper response, so Betty admitted that she was arrested, but it did not pertain to anything violent. She was arrested for public lewdness when she was inside of the Charlie's Angels bar where she was employed, but not on the clock when she was arrested. She said that she was auditioning. "Well, it's a topless place, but I wasn't topless." That was it that was said on that, and then Betty talked about how she was previously convicted of another misdemeanor offense when she shot one of her ex-husbands, Billy Lane, in self-defense. She claimed that she had no intention of killing him. Lastly, Betty claimed that she had no idea Doyle was buried in her backyard. On October 11, 1985, the jury found Betty guilty of the capital murder of Jimmy Beets. On October 14, 1985, she was sentenced to death for his murder. Because she was sentenced to death in this first trial, the courts decided not to have a separate trial for the murder of Doyle Wayne Barker. Betty had her automatic appeals, and Betty claimed that there was no proof she killed for the purpose of obtaining insurance pension benefits, so she was granted a rehearing of the case. The appeals court agreed that she never made any attempts of her own to collect any insurance money for Jimmy's death. On September 2, 1988, after the rehearing, the Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed Betty's conviction and sentence. The United States Supreme Court denied her petition on June 26, 1989. Over the next few years, Betty was granted a few more stays of execution. Her official execution date was now set for February 24, 2000, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. She denied a final meal and also refused to make a final statement. She died by method of lethal injection and was pronounced dead at 6:18 p.m. Betty was 62 years old at the time of her death. She had 5 children, 9 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. Betty was cremated after her death, and her ashes were scattered over her mother's grave. As for her daughter Shirley Fergala, she made a few TV appearances, but over the years, something prevented her from living a healthy, stable, crime-free life. I'm going to include records of all the times she was arrested and her mugshots. As you can see, it looks like she suffers from substance abuse. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. See you guys for the next premiere. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.